March 1979. Somewhere beneath the cold grey surface of the Barents Sea, a Western listening post is tracking a shadow. The operators are trained men. They have spent years learning the sound of the ocean. They know the low churn of a Soviet missile boat. They know the steady beat of a diesel patrol craft snorkeling at night. They know the rhythm of the sea itself, the groan of ice, the click of shrimp, and the distant song of whales. And on this day, they hear something that does not fit any of it. A contact appears in the deep water off the northern Soviet coast. It is moving, then it begins to accelerate. The numbers climbing across the display do not make sense. The contact pushes past 30 knots, a speed already at the edge of what a submerged submarine should be able to sustain. Then it keeps going. It passes 35. It passes 40. A submerged vessel is now moving faster than most surface warships in the world. Faster than the torpedoes many navies would fire to stop it, and it is doing this hundreds of feet below the waves, as if the water were barely there. The analysts who later studied that data reached a single unavoidable conclusion. The Soviets had not built a better version of an old idea. They had built something new, something that broke the quiet assumptions Western navies had relied on for a generation, and for a while, the men who studied it could barely bring themselves to believe it was real. The vessel making that impossible run had a plain Soviet designation. It was called Project 705. Its poetic Russian name was Lyra. But across the wardrooms and intelligence offices of the West, it would earn a different name, a name spoken with a mix of admiration and dread. NATO called it the Alpha. Underneath the reporting name was a machine unlike anything else in the water. Its hull was not made of steel. It was carved from titanium, a metal so difficult to work that entire specialized facilities had to be built just to weld it. Its crew was not the 100 or more men who packed a normal attack submarine. It was around 30 people, almost every one of them a commissioned officer, because the boat was so automated that ordinary sailors were considered unnecessary. And at the heart of the vessel sat the strangest feature of all. Its nuclear reactor was not cooled by ordinary water. It was cooled by liquid metal, a molten alloy of lead and bismuth that had to be kept hot and flowing at all times because if it were ever allowed to cool down and go solid, the reactor would be ruined forever. This is the story of that machine. It is the story of a submarine so far ahead of its time that the most powerful navies on Earth scrambled to build new weapons just to counter it. And it is the story of the single fatal flaw hidden inside its greatest strength, a flaw that would eventually turn the fastest submarine ever built into a frozen monument to its own ambition. If the engineering and the secret history of the Cold War at sea is the kind of thing that pulls you in, consider subscribing, because we take these declassified programs apart piece by piece and rebuild the story of how they actually worked. To understand how a machine this radical ever came to exist, we have to go back to the fear that created it. In the years after the Second World War, the ocean became the front line of a new and silent conflict. The two superpowers could not fight each other openly without risking the end of the world. So they fought in the shadows, and much of that struggle took place underwater. The United States and its allies built quiet, patient hunter submarines and vast networks of undersea listening arrays. They strung sensitive microphones across the floor of the Atlantic. They learned to recognize individual Soviet boats by the unique sound each one made. Their goal was simple and relentless. They wanted to track every Soviet submarine that tried to slip out into the open ocean, and if war ever came, they wanted to kill those submarines before they could do any harm. Soviet planners, watching this net tighten around them, understood the problem with brutal clarity. Their submarines were being followed the moment they left port. Western hunters were quieter. Western sensors were better. In a straight contest of stealth, the Soviets were losing, and they knew it. Their boats might be trailed across an entire ocean, shadowed by an enemy they could not even hear, and in a real war they might be sunk before they ever reached the targets they were sent to attack. To a Soviet admiral, this was an intolerable situation. The whole point of a submarine is that no one knows where it is. If the enemy always knew, the submarine was worthless. The Soviet answer was not to build a stealthier submarine, it was to build a faster one. If a boat could not hide, then perhaps it could simply run. Perhaps it could accelerate so violently and turn so sharply that no torpedo could hold a lock on it, and no enemy submarine could keep pace. Picture a hunter who has crept up behind his prey, certain of the kill, only to watch that prey explode into motion and vanish before he can pull the trigger. That was the vision. A submarine that could turn the tables on its pursuers, that could shrug off an attack through raw performance, that could dash to intercept an enemy formation and then escape before the enemy could respond. The idea took shape at a Leningrad design bureau known by the initials SKB-143, an organization that would later take the name Malachite. This bureau had already helped create the first Soviet nuclear submarine, so its engineers were no strangers to bold work. In the late 1950s, a designer there named Anatoly Petrov proposed something that sounded almost like science fiction. He imagined a small, single-shaft nuclear submarine, radically automated, stripped of every excess, and built for one purpose above all others: speed. His colleagues sometimes described the concept in the language of aviation. They were not building a submarine in the ordinary sense. They were building an interceptor, a fighter plane for the deep. There was a cold logic to choosing speed above all else. A submarine that cannot be hidden can still be made impossible to catch. If Western hunters were always going to hear the Soviet boats leaving port, then the Soviet boats would simply refuse to be pinned down once they were found. Speed became a form of armor. It became a way to break contact, to force a pursuer into a hopeless tail chase, to reach a firing position before the enemy could react, and then to disappear before the enemy could strike back. In a war beneath the waves, seconds and knots could decide who lived and who died, and the Alpha was designed to win that contest of raw physics. It was a gamble that the fundamental math of the chase could be rewritten in the Soviet Union's favor. The Soviet leadership took the idea seriously. On June 23, 1960, a joint decree from the highest levels of the Soviet state formally authorized the program. The chief designer role fell to Mikhail Rusanov, who pushed the concept from a paper dream toward a buildable ship. The scientific supervision came from some of the most senior figures in the entire Soviet nuclear establishment, the same men who had guided the atomic program itself. This was not a minor project handed to junior engineers. It was a national effort, backed by the full weight of the state, and the program was granted something almost unheard of in Soviet shipbuilding. The designers were given permission to break the existing rules. They were allowed to set aside established construction norms where they could justify it, because the leadership understood a hard truth. An ordinary submarine built by ordinary methods, using ordinary materials and ordinary machinery, would never reach the performance they wanted. To build something revolutionary, the designers would have to abandon the safe and the proven at nearly every turn. And so they did. That freedom is the key to everything that followed. Consider the paradox at the center of this whole endeavor. To build a submarine that could outrun its enemies, the Soviets had to reject nearly every safe, well-understood method of building submarines. They chose the exotic over the reliable again and again. A more powerful reactor that was harder to tame. A lighter hull metal that was nearly impossible to weld. A crew so small that the machine itself had to do much of the thinking. Each of these choices bought speed, and each of these choices planted a seed of fragility. The Alpha would become a masterpiece of engineering ambition. It would also become a masterpiece of accumulated risk, a vessel where every brilliant decision carried a hidden cost that would only reveal itself years later, out at sea, far from the men who had signed the plans. To understand how the whole thing eventually came apart, you have to understand each of these gambles in turn. And the first of them was the very skin of the ship. Almost every submarine in the world was built from steel, because steel was strong, cheap, and thoroughly understood. Shipyards had worked with it for a century. The Alpha was built from titanium instead. On paper, the reasoning was flawless. Titanium is remarkably strong for its weight, so a titanium hull could be lighter than a steel one of the same strength. And a lighter boat is a faster boat. Titanium also resists the crushing pressure of the deep, so the submarine could dive to depths that would crumple a conventional hull like a tin can. And titanium is barely magnetic, which meant that one of the West's favorite detection tools, the magnetic sensors carried by patrol aircraft, would struggle to find it. For a machine designed to be fast and deep and hard to detect all at once, titanium seemed like a gift from the future. There was another quiet advantage to diving deep that is easy to miss. The ocean is not a uniform space. Layers of water at different temperatures bend and trap sound in strange ways, creating shadow zones where a hunter's sonar simply cannot reach. A submarine able to dive below the reach of its enemies could slip beneath these acoustic barriers, using the physics of the sea itself as a shield. Combined with raw speed, great depth gave the Alpha a genuine freedom of movement through the ocean that shallower boats could only envy. It could go where the weapons could not easily follow, and where the listening arrays lost their grip. On paper, the picture was almost perfect. A fast, deep, faintly magnetic hunter that could strike and vanish at will. The trouble, as always with this submarine, lived in the gap between the elegant paper and the stubborn steel. The reality was a nightmare of manufacturing. Titanium cannot simply be welded in an ordinary shipyard the way steel can. When it is heated in open air, it greedily absorbs oxygen and other gases from the atmosphere, and those gases turn the once tough metal brittle and prone to cracking. A weld made carelessly in the open air would be a weak point waiting to fail under the enormous pressures of the deep. To join titanium properly, Soviet engineers had to build enormous sealed halls filled with inert argon gas, vast workspaces where ordinary breathable air was pushed out entirely and replaced with a gas that would not react with the hot metal. Inside these chambers, the work looked like something from another world. Welders labored in sealed protective suits with their own air supply, because a human being cannot breathe in a room full of argon. They moved slowly through an artificial atmosphere, joining the great titanium sections in an environment that resembled a spacecraft assembly bay more than a traditional shipyard. Every seam demanded patience, skill, and conditions that almost no other shipbuilding program on Earth could provide. The cost of all this was staggering. Titanium itself was expensive to mine and refine, and this painstaking way of working with it multiplied the price many times over. Every alpha that slid into the water represented a fortune in exotic metal and specialized labor. The submarine was fast in part because it was light, and it was light because it was made of a material that fought its builders at every single step. Even with all that care, the titanium was not trouble-free. Working with the metal at this scale was still new, and the risk of cracking remained a persistent worry across the Soviet titanium submarine programs. The very quality that made titanium valuable, its strength combined with its lightness, sat right beside the quality that made it dangerous, its sensitivity during construction and its unforgiving nature if something went wrong. The hull was a genuine triumph, a piece of metalworking that few nations could have matched. It was also a warning, if anyone had chosen to read it, of how this entire submarine would behave. Extraordinary capability wrapped around a core of hidden fragility. And the hull, as difficult as it was, would prove to be the simplest of the Alpha's problems. Because inside that gleaming titanium shell sat the single most daring gamble of the whole design. To reach the speeds the planners dreamed of, the Alpha needed a reactor that was small, light, and capable of pouring out enormous power on demand. An ordinary submarine reactor uses pressurized water to carry heat away from the nuclear core. Water works, and it is forgiving, and the whole world eventually settled on it as the standard. But water is also bulky, and it must be kept under tremendous pressure to stop it from boiling, and it limits how compact and how responsive the power plant can be. For a boat obsessed with speed and size, water cooling was a compromise the Soviet designers refused to accept. They chose a different path, one that only a handful of engineers in the world had ever seriously pursued. They cooled their reactor with liquid metal, a molten alloy of lead and bismuth flowing through the core like hot blood through a body. The advantages were real and dramatic. Liquid metal can carry heat far more efficiently than water in a plant of this kind, and it does not need to be held under the same extreme pressure. That allowed the reactor to be smaller and lighter for the power it produced, generating on the order of 155 megawatts of thermal power from a remarkably compact package. Two different design teams actually developed two versions of this liquid metal plant in parallel, a way of hedging the enormous risk, and both were fitted to boats of the class. Whichever version a given submarine carried, the principle was the same, and the payoff was the same. It is hard to overstate how far outside the mainstream this choice sat. Around the world, navies were converging on water-cooled reactors precisely because they were understood and controllable. A handful of experiments elsewhere with more exotic coolants had ended in frustration and had been quietly abandoned. The Soviet designers pressed forward anyway, into territory their rivals had chosen to avoid, betting that they could take a technology others had judged too temperamental to trust at sea. That took real courage and real arrogance in roughly equal measure. It was the same spirit that ran through the entire program, a willingness to seize the difficult prize that everyone else had left on the table and to accept whatever price came attached to it. Just as important as the size was the responsiveness. The plant could change its power level with startling speed. Where a normal submarine took its time carefully working up to full power, the Alpha could surge almost at once. Accounts of the class describe it going from a near stop to full speed in about a minute, and reversing its thrust to slam to a halt in well under a minute more. Imagine a warship the size of a small building accelerating like a sports car and stopping like one too. That responsiveness was the whole point. It was what would let the boat leap into a chase, or twist and sprint away from an incoming weapon in the crucial seconds when survival was decided. The liquid metal core was the beating engine of the interceptor dream, and on its own terms it worked brilliantly. But the alloy that made all of this possible carried a curse written into its own chemistry. Lead and bismuth, mixed in this way, freeze solid at a temperature of roughly 125 degrees Celsius. That single number is the hinge on which this entire story turns. It means the coolant is only a liquid when it is kept extremely hot. Let it fall below that threshold, and the metal in the pipes and around the core hardens into a solid mass. And here is the cruel part. Once that alloy freezes inside the reactor, you cannot simply reheat it and carry on. The freezing can crack the delicate internal plumbing as the metal changes shape. It can trap the nuclear fuel inside a block of solidified coolant. In practical terms, a reactor whose coolant is allowed to freeze is not merely broken. It is dead. It cannot be repaired. It becomes a lump of radioactive scrap sealed inside a priceless titanium hull. The consequence of this was a demand unlike anything faced by a normal warship. The Alpha's reactor could almost never be allowed to fully cool down. Not at sea, not in port, not during a quiet week when nothing was happening. Even sitting motionless at its pier, even when the submarine was doing absolutely nothing, that molten metal had to be kept hot and liquid. This required a constant supply of heat from outside the boat, superheated steam piped in from special shore facilities to keep the coolant flowing around the clock every hour of every day for the entire life of the submarine. Think about what that really meant. The Alpha, this fast and free predator of the deep, was in truth tethered to the land by an invisible umbilical of heat. It could dash across the ocean at will, but it could never truly rest. It could never simply be shut down and left alone like an ordinary ship between missions. The moment its life support from shore failed, a countdown began, silent and merciless, and at the end of that countdown lay a frozen, ruined heart. A submarine built to be the most independent hunter in the fleet was, in a strange and bitter way, the most dependent vessel the Soviet Navy had ever put to sea. There was one more hazard buried in the coolant, quieter but no less serious. As the reactor ran, the bismuth in the alloy slowly transformed under the constant bombardment of the nuclear core into polonium, one of the most intensely radioactive and toxic substances known to science. Sealed inside its loop, contained within the plumbing, the danger stayed locked away. But any leak, any spill of that molten metal would release not just scalding liquid but a deadly radioactive contaminant into the compartment. The men who served aboard the Alpha lived a few steel bulkheads away from a substance that had to be respected with something close to fear. The reactor gave the submarine its astonishing life. It also filled that life with a constant grinding vigilance, and it quietly set a trap that would one day spring shut. If the reactor was the boat's beating heart, its automation was the boat's nervous system, and it too broke sharply with everything that had come before. A conventional attack submarine of that era carried a large crew, often well over 100 men, each with a specialized job, because running a warship underwater is an enormously complex task. There were men to work the sonar, men to steer, men to manage the reactor, men to load the torpedoes, men to cook and clean and keep the endless machinery alive. The Alpha turned that entire idea on its head. The designers automated everything they possibly could. The sensors, the weapons, the reactor, the ship's movement through the water, all of it was tied into an integrated control system so advanced that the entire submarine could, in principle, be run from a single central command post. The crew shrank to around 30, because the remaining jobs were so demanding and so technical. The men who filled them were almost all officers. There was little room aboard for ordinary enlisted sailors performing routine tasks, because the machines were meant to perform those tasks themselves. The Alpha was sometimes described, with only slight exaggeration, as a submarine crewed entirely by its own leadership. A wardroom that went to sea without a lower deck. It was a genuinely futuristic notion, the idea that a warship could be run like a cockpit, by a small team of experts, each commanding a share of an intelligent machine. The logic behind it was elegant. Fewer men meant less air, less food, less fresh water, and less living space to carry, which meant a smaller and lighter and therefore faster boat. Every sailor you remove is weight you no longer have to push through the water. Automation also promised speed of a different kind. In the chaos of combat, a handful of highly trained specialists could react almost instantly without the delays of shouting orders down a long chain of men. In the best moments, the Alpha behaved less like a ship full of people and more like a single machine with a few human minds at its core, thinking and acting as one. It was a vision of the future of naval warfare, arriving decades before the rest of the world was ready for it. But automation in that era was young, and young technology fails. The electronic systems that the whole crew concept depended on were not always reliable, and when something broke down at sea, there simply were not enough hands aboard to fix everything at once. The submarine had not really been designed for long voyages full of running repairs. It had been designed to sprint, to strike, and to come home. Its whole existence was built around short, intense bursts of activity, rather than the patient, grinding endurance of a long patrol. Life aboard was cramped and demanding, and the vessel leaned heavily on support from shore for the kind of maintenance a larger crew might have simply handled themselves out at sea. The small crew was a brilliant solution to the problem of speed. It was also a fragile bet on machines that were not yet mature, and it meant that the boat's fate rested on a very thin margin of human hands. The designers did add one remarkable safety feature, a sign that they understood at least some of the dangers they were building into this ship. The Alpha was fitted with an escape capsule set into its sail, large enough to hold the entire crew, designed to detach from the hull and carry every man to the surface, even from great depth. It was among the first Soviet submarines to carry such a system. In a boat this radical, running this fast, diving this deep, with a reactor this unforgiving, the ability for the whole crew to escape at once was not a luxury feature. It was a sober acknowledgement, built right into the steel, of just how much could go wrong. It is worth pausing to imagine what daily life was actually like for the small band of men who took these submarines to sea. They were an unusual crew by any standard, a tight circle of highly trained specialists in a cramped titanium tube, each one responsible for systems that would normally occupy several sailors on any other boat. There was little of the redundancy that made life on a larger submarine forgiving. If one man fell ill, or made a mistake, or simply grew exhausted, there was rarely another already trained and standing by to take his place at that exact station. Every member of the crew mattered enormously, and every member knew it. They lived pressed close together, surrounded by humming automation, a short walk from a reactor whose coolant could kill them if it ever escaped its pipes. It demanded a particular kind of nerve to serve aboard a machine like that, to trust the systems, to trust each other, and to sprint into the deep at speeds no other submariners in the world had ever known. And when everything worked, the results were breathtaking. This is where the Alpha earned its legend, and where the fear it inspired was fully justified. In its element, at speed, it was arguably the fastest military submarine ever to enter service, matched only by a single one-off Soviet experimental boat that never became a real class. Its sustained submerged speed sat somewhere in the low 40s in knots, with brief bursts reported to be higher still. That figure sounds abstract until you place it against reality. A submerged Alpha could keep pace with a fast surface warship steaming at full power across the open sea. It could run down most vessels afloat and outrun most that tried to chase it, all while hidden beneath the waves. Now add depth to the picture. The Alpha did not just go fast, it went deep. Its test depth reached down toward 400 meters, with everyday operating depths of a few hundred meters, giving it an enormous volume of ocean in which to hide and maneuver. Diving that deep put it below the reach of many weapons and complicated every attempt to track it. Western intelligence, working with incomplete information and a healthy dose of anxiety, sometimes guessed the depths were even greater than they truly were, which only deepened the alarm. A boat that could be almost anywhere in a vast column of water, moving faster than the weapons sent to kill it, was a genuine nightmare for anyone trying to hunt it. The boat's weapons and sensors were tied into one of the first Soviet computerized combat systems, capable of taking in information from its sonar and helping the tiny crew make firing decisions quickly. It carried torpedoes and tubes in its bow, and it could launch missiles designed to streak toward enemy submarines. But its most famous trick had nothing to do with what it fired. It was the way the boat could move. In exercises, the Alpha reportedly used sheer speed and violently sharp turns to slip away from torpedoes fired at it, twisting out of the path of a weapon that should have killed it. This is the origin of the idea captured in its fearsome reputation, and it is worth being precise about, because the truth is more interesting than the myth. Some of the torpedoes in Western arsenals during the boat's early years genuinely could not reliably run down a target that was this fast, this deep, and this willing to turn hard at the last moment. A torpedo has only so much speed and only so much fuel. If the target is nearly as quick as the weapon and can force it into a long tail chase or a series of hard turns, the torpedo can run out of energy before it ever reaches its prey. The Alpha did not necessarily outrun every weapon in a simple straight line. What it did was push well beyond the comfortable envelope that NATO's existing torpedoes had been built to handle, turning what should have been a certain kill into a difficult, uncertain problem. And for a hunter, being difficult to kill is nearly as valuable as being able to kill. A submarine that can survive the first shot lives to fire back. There was, of course, a price hidden even inside the boat's greatest triumph, and by now you can probably guess its shape. All that speed came with noise. When the Alpha opened up and ran flat out, it was loud, and a loud submarine is a submarine that can be heard from far away. At high speed, the boat traded away its stealth in exchange for velocity, roaring through the water in a way that quiet Western hunters could pick up at a distance. At low, careful speeds, it was far harder to find, no worse than many other boats of its day. But the very moment it used its signature ability, the moment it became the fast interceptor it was born to be, it announced its presence to anyone listening. This was the recurring theme of the entire design, appearing yet again. Every strength carried a shadow. The speed that made the Alpha a nightmare to catch was the same speed that made it easy to hear. Still, in the late 1970s, sitting in Western intelligence offices, the shadows were easy to overlook. What analysts saw was a Soviet submarine that had leapt an entire generation ahead, and their reaction reveals just how deeply the Alpha cut into Western confidence. For years, some analysts had simply refused to believe the Soviets could build such a thing at all, or could ever produce it in real numbers. The assumption ran deep, almost like an article of faith, that the Soviet Union would never gamble so many untested technologies in a single design, that they were too cautious, too conservative, to combine so many risks in one hull. It was comforting to believe. It was also wrong. When the evidence became undeniable, when the boat was seen and eventually heard doing exactly what it had been built to do, the mood shifted towards something close to shock. One officer who worked on the Western intelligence effort later described the conclusion in stark terms. The Soviets, he wrote, had made a genuine leap forward in submarine technology, combining several high-risk options into a single class of ship. The comfortable assumptions had failed. The Alpha had rewritten what the West believed was possible beneath the waves, and it forced a hard reckoning about how badly the enemy's capabilities had been underestimated. But here is the irony that sits at the center of this story. The machine that had unsettled the world's most powerful navy was already carrying, deep inside its titanium hull, the very flaw that would undo it. And the first boat off the line was about to prove it, in the worst possible way. The Western journey to that realization had been a slow and uncertain one. The first hints of the new submarine had appeared years earlier, glimpsed under construction, studied in fragments, argued over in windowless rooms. Analysts had debated what they were looking at, some insisting it must be a modest evolution of older designs, others slowly coming to suspect the truth. Piecing together the real nature of a secret Soviet weapon was painstaking work, assembled from scraps of imagery, snatches of sound, and educated guesses, and for a long time the picture stayed frustratingly incomplete. Only gradually did the scattered clues resolve into a single startling image of a boat that could do things no Western submarine could match. That long climb toward understanding is part of why the Alpha unsettled its adversaries so deeply. It had been hiding in plain sight, and the West had been slow to grasp what it truly was. That first boat carried the designation K-64. It was completed at the very end of 1971, the lead vessel of the entire program. The physical proof that all the theory and the ambition and the argon-filled welding halls could be turned into a real submarine floating in real water. It represented years of work and a mountain of national resources. It was meant to be the beginning of a new era for the Soviet submarine fleet. Instead, it revealed the terrible truth about the Alpha's reactor almost immediately. Within months of entering service, the liquid metal plant aboard K-64 began to fail. The exact sequence has been described in several ways over the years, but the essence is agonizingly consistent with everything the design had always threatened. A problem developed in the primary cooling system. Coolant that was supposed to stay molten and moving began to leak and to lose its heat. And once that heat was lost, the lead and bismuth alloy did precisely what its chemistry demanded that it do. It began to freeze. Solid metal formed where liquid metal was supposed to flow. The reactor's internal passages seized and clogged. This was not the kind of damage a crew could patch at sea or a shipyard could repair in a week or a month. It was catastrophic, and it was permanent. The heart of the lead ship of the class had quite literally turned to stone. What happened next reads almost like a grim joke told by the men who lived through it. The submarine was so new, so valuable, and so poorly understood that engineers wanted to study exactly what had gone wrong inside it. So K-64 was taken to a northern shipyard, and there the once proud vessel was physically cut into sections so that its ruined reactor compartment could be pulled open and examined. The great titanium hull, the fastest thing in the ocean, lay opened like a specimen on a laboratory table. Soviet submariners later joked with the dark humor of people who work around real danger that K-64 had become the longest submarine in the world because it now existed in two separate pieces in two separate places. The bow section was eventually put to use ashore as a training aid, a teaching tool for the crews who would serve on the boats that followed. Sit with the weight of that for a moment. The lead ship of the most advanced submarine class of its age never got the chance to prove itself in the role it was built for. It never chased down an enemy formation. It never demonstrated its legendary speed in anything other than trials. It had been in service for only a short time before its reactor froze solid, and then it was effectively finished, sawn apart, and studied like a failed experiment. The failure was severe enough that the chief designer of the program was removed from his post in its aftermath, and a successor took over the daunting task of making the whole concept actually work in the real world. The dream had met the sea, and the sea had won the first round decisively. You might expect a disaster like that to end the program on the spot. It did not. The Soviets had invested far too much money, too much prestige, and too much faith to walk away, and they still believed deeply in the underlying idea. The remaining boats of the class were built and commissioned through the rest of the 1970s and into the early 1980s, 7 vessels in all across the whole program, constructed at shipyards in Leningrad and in the far north. The lead ship's death was treated as a hard lesson rather than a final verdict. Engineers refined the reactors, tightened the procedures, trained the crews harder, and pressed on. And for a time, the surviving Alphas did operate. They went to sea. They ran fast. They worried NATO exactly as intended. But the fundamental trap that had killed K-64 had not been removed from the design. It had only been managed, and managing it, day after day, year after year, turned out to be a relentless and exhausting burden that never once let up. The core problem simply never went away. That molten coolant still had to be kept hot every single hour of every single day, whether the boat was racing beneath the ocean or tied up quietly at its base. This placed an enormous, unending demand on the shore facilities that supplied the heat, the special installations that kept the steam flowing into the reactors of boats sitting in port. And those facilities, it turned out, were not always up to the task. Equipment wore out. Systems broke down. Supplies ran short. When the shore-based heating faltered, the crews faced a terrible choice with no good answer. If they let the reactor cool, they risked repeating the exact death that had destroyed K-64, freezing the coolant and ruining an irreplaceable ship. So instead, crews were often forced to keep their reactors running at low power continuously, day after day after day, for no other reason than to generate enough heat to keep the coolant from solidifying. But a nuclear reactor is not meant to run forever without rest. Keeping it lit around the clock, month after month, wore it out and consumed its useful life far faster than intended. It also chained the crew to the boat, demanding that men remain aboard and vigilant even in port, tending a machine that could never be allowed to fully sleep. Think of the bitter contradiction in that. The Interceptor, the boat designed to leap into action at a moment's notice from a state of quiet readiness, instead spent much of its existence chained to its pier, its exhausted crew standing an endless watch over a heart that could not be permitted to grow cold. The freedom the Alpha promised was, in daily practice, a kind of imprisonment. Then, in April of 1982, the trap sprang shut a second time. One of the northern-built Alphas, the boat designated K-123, suffered its own coolant catastrophe while it was out on patrol. A leak developed in the reactor system, and a large quantity of the molten lead and bismuth alloy, reported at around 2 tons of the stuff, escaped from where it belonged and flooded into the reactor compartment, where it cooled and hardened into a solid mass. Once again, a reactor was destroyed. Once again, an Alpha was crippled by the very substance that gave it life. The design's central weakness had claimed a second victim in almost exactly the way its critics might have feared. This time, however, the Soviets attempted something extraordinary in response. Rather than scrap the boat as they had scrapped K-64, they undertook a rebuild that would consume years. The entire ruined reactor section was cut out of the submarine, and remarkably, the replacement fitted in its place was not another liquid metal plant at all. It was a conventional pressurized water reactor, the ordinary kind used in other Soviet submarines, the very technology the Alpha's designers had once rejected as too heavy and too slow. It was an enormous, expensive effort, taking most of a decade to complete. And in its own quiet way, it was a confession. The dream of the pure liquid metal interceptor was proving too costly and too dangerous to sustain, and even its own builders were beginning to retreat from it. The K-123 rebuild also revealed something about how the Soviet system valued these boats. Faced with a crippled submarine, a normal navy might have written it off and moved on. Instead, engineers poured years of labor into resurrecting a single hull, cutting it open, transplanting an entirely different kind of reactor into its body, and stitching it back together. That decision speaks to just how precious each titanium hull was, and how much had been sunk into building them. You do not spend most of a decade rebuilding a ship you consider disposable. The Alphas were too valuable to abandon and too flawed to trust, and that contradiction defined nearly everything about how they were used and cared for. By this point, the Alpha program had settled into a strange and deeply unhappy equilibrium. Here were some of the most advanced submarines ever built by any nation, capable of feats that genuinely terrified the world's strongest navy. And yet they spent enormous portions of their lives immobile, tied to a pier, dependent on shore support, watched over by weary crews, haunted always by the knowledge that a single failure of heat could turn a priceless masterpiece into a radioactive tomb. The trap ran deeper still. The reactors could not be refueled and serviced the way normal reactors could, because the same freezing problem complicated everything about handling the core. The nuclear fuel and the solidified coolant tended to fuse together into a single stubborn mass, which meant that even the eventual job of taking these reactors apart, at the very end of their lives, would become a specialized nightmare all its own. The Alpha was trapped inside its own brilliance. Its greatest innovation had become its greatest liability, and there was no simple way out of the box it had built for itself. And here is where the story turns in an unexpected direction, because for all its troubles, the Alpha achieved a kind of victory that had nothing whatsoever to do with firing a shot in anger. To see it, you have to stop thinking about the submarine purely as a weapon and start thinking about it as a message, a signal sent across the ocean to the mind of the enemy. The Alpha's real target was never a particular enemy ship. Its real target was the confidence, the planning, and the wallet of the entire Western alliance. And against that target, it struck with devastating and lasting effect. Western navies could not simply ignore a Soviet submarine that could outrun their torpedoes and dive below their weapons. To do nothing would be to accept that their entire method of hunting Soviet submarines might fail in a war. So they reacted, and they reacted at great cost. In the United States, the primary submarine-killing torpedo of the era was pushed through a series of urgent upgrades, driven in significant part by the specific need to counter this fast, deep-diving Soviet threat. Engineers worked to give the weapon more speed, more diving depth, and more capability, producing advanced new versions precisely because the older ones could no longer be trusted against a boat like the Alpha. A whole weapon was reshaped by the existence of a single class of enemy submarine. Across the Atlantic, the British pursued their own answer. They developed a powerful new heavyweight torpedo built expressly to catch high-speed, deep-diving Soviet submarines, a weapon capable of a blistering terminal sprint in its final approach, fast enough to run down a target that could move like the Alpha. The requirement that shaped that torpedo came directly from the threat the Alpha represented. The Americans also explored standoff weapons that could deliver an attack from a safe distance, partly with this same fast Soviet boat in mind. Across the Western world, fortunes were spent, programs were launched, and an entire generation of undersea weaponry was quietly redesigned in the long shadow of a submarine that never sank anything at all. The intelligence value was just as striking, and here the Alpha exposed a raw nerve running through Western confidence. The effort to understand this one submarine consumed years of work and significant resources across multiple agencies. At one point, a senior American naval official noted that the intelligence gathered about the Soviet boat had saved the United States Navy a very large sum, a figure cited at $325 million in torpedo development costs, because truly understanding the nature of the threat allowed the West to aim its enormous spending far more precisely instead of guessing in the dark. And when Western sensors finally confirmed just how fast the Alpha really was, catching it in the act during that deep-water run off the northern coast, the achievement was significant enough to be treated as a major intelligence event in its own right. Step back and take in the full strangeness of it. A submarine that spent much of its life tied to a pier, kept alive by a hose of steam, had nonetheless reached across an entire ocean and reshaped the plans, the budgets, and the deepest fears of its adversaries. In the peculiar arithmetic of the Cold War, that was a real form of victory. The Alpha did not defeat NATO in any battle. It never had the chance to try. What it did was defeat NATO's assumptions and force the most powerful navy on Earth to run hard, spend billions, and rethink its playbook just to catch up with a threat that mostly sat quietly at its dock in the frozen north. For a while, in the middle of the 1980s, it might have looked as though the enormous gamble was finally paying off. The surviving Alphas were in service. The West was scrambling to respond. The boats stood as a genuine technological edge, a vivid demonstration that Soviet designers could reach places their rivals could not yet follow. The image of the Alpha as an unstoppable titanium predator settled into the popular imagination on both sides of the Iron Curtain, and it never fully left. On the surface, in these years, the long and painful story of the fast submarine seemed at last to be a story of triumph, hard-won and terribly expensive, but real. Underneath that surface, though, the truth was quietly hardening, much like the very coolant the crews had learned to fear. The burden of keeping these boats alive never eased for a moment. Every day still demanded heat, vigilance, and specialized support that strained the system, providing it to the breaking point. The submarines remained breathtakingly expensive to build and punishing to maintain. Their reactors continued to wear down under the constant low-power running needed to hold the coolant in its liquid state. The very features that made these boats special also made them rare, delicate, and difficult. A tiny fleet of thoroughbreds that needed constant, costly care simply to keep them from breaking. A navy can field a handful of such machines. It cannot easily build its future around them. And beyond the boats themselves, the great country that had built them was beginning to falter. The Soviet economy was straining under enormous and growing pressures through the 1980s. Money grew tight, priorities shifted, and a small fleet of exquisite, high-maintenance interceptors was exactly the kind of expensive luxury that becomes impossible to justify when the treasury is running dry and hard choices have to be made. The Alpha had always demanded more than an ordinary submarine. Soon, the nation would no longer be able to give it what it needed. The reckoning, when it finally came, was swift. As the 1980s drew to a close and the Soviet Union itself began sliding toward its collapse, the Alpha fleet ran out of time. The first of the operational boats had already been withdrawn from service in the late 1980s. Then, in 1990, in what amounted to a single decisive stroke, most of the remaining Alphas were struck from the fleet together. The interceptors were simply too costly to keep, too demanding to sustain, and too much the product of a world that was rapidly vanishing. The boats that had once made Western admirals lie awake at night were tied up for the last time, shut down, and marked for disposal. Only the rebuilt K-123, the boat that had traded its liquid metal heart for an ordinary reactor, lingered on into the middle of the 1990s, serving quietly in a training role before it too was finally retired, the last survivor of a bold and broken idea. Even in death, the Alphas refused to be ordinary because their unique reactors created a disposal problem unlike almost any other in the history of the nuclear age. The frozen and fused cores could not be handled using the usual methods for taking a submarine reactor apart. The nuclear fuel, locked together with its own solidified coolant into a single dense mass, demanded specialized equipment and dedicated facilities that barely existed anywhere in the world. In the far north of Russia, one particular naval base became one of the only places on Earth even capable of dealing with these strange dead hearts. And even there, the grim work required international help, including specialized equipment developed with foreign assistance in order to safely extract and store the ruined cores where they could do no harm. Dismantling a single Alpha reportedly cost a fortune in its own right, a final bill added to a lifetime of enormous expense. And so the ledger of the whole program came due. The submarines had been costly to imagine, costly to build in their argon-filled hulls, costly to operate with their endless demand for heat, and now costly even to destroy. They consumed resources at every single stage of their existence, from the very first line drawn on an engineer's drafting table to the last radioactive fragment sealed away in a storage container in the Arctic. Few weapons in history have demanded so much and delivered their return in so strange a currency. Step back from the details now, and the deeper meaning of the Alpha comes clearly into focus, because this was never really a story about a submarine that simply failed. It is a story about the difference between what is brilliant and what is wise, and those two things are not the same. The engineers who created the Alpha were not fools chasing a doomed fantasy. They were among the most talented designers of their entire generation, and they solved genuine problems that no one else in the world had solved. The titanium hull, the liquid metal reactor, the deep automation, the sheer astonishing speed. Each of these was a real achievement that pushed the boundaries of what a machine was capable of doing. In the narrow sense of building the fastest, deepest diving, most heavily automated interceptor that could be imagined, they succeeded completely and without question. Their failure was a failure of a completely different kind, and it is one that echoes far beyond the world of submarines. They built a machine that was magnificent in a single dazzling moment and nearly impossible to sustain across the long, grinding, unglamorous years of real service. They optimized so fiercely, so single-mindedly for peak performance that they quietly sacrificed the humble virtues that actually keep a warship useful over its lifetime. Reliability, simplicity, the ability to rest, to be repaired with ordinary tools by ordinary methods, to endure hardship, to be left alone when not needed, and to spring back to life when called. The Alpha could do something no other submarine on Earth could do. But it could almost never afford to actually do it, and it could not simply exist quietly the way a fighting ship must exist for most of its days. The lesson buried inside that titanium hull is one worth carrying far beyond the sea. Raw capability is not the same thing as real strength. A tool that must be perfectly tended every hour of every day, that punishes a single lapse with total destruction, is a tool that will eventually be let down by the imperfect world around it, because the world is always imperfect. The Alpha demanded a level of flawless, unbroken support that no shore facility, no crew, no fleet, and ultimately no country could keep providing forever. It was not defeated by an enemy. It was defeated by the impossible standard it set for its own survival. There is one final image that captures the whole strange saga, and it needs nothing added to it. The Alpha was the fastest submarine ever to serve in any navy. A titanium arrow built to slice through the deep and leave every pursuer helplessly behind. And yet it spent the greater part of its existence going absolutely nowhere at all, tied to a pier, kept barely alive by a hose of steam running in from the shore, watched over through the long polar nights by tired officers whose most important duty was simply to make certain its exotic heart did not grow cold. It was a racehorse that could almost never be let out of the stable. And when the heat finally failed on the very first of them, the molten metal inside froze into a solid, ruined mass, and the greatest submarine of its age was rendered lifeless by nothing more dramatic than the loss of a little warmth. The machine built to conquer the ocean was defeated in the end by the simple chemistry of cooling metal. The Soviet Union that dreamed up the Alpha is gone now, dissolved into history along with the great rivalry that gave the boat its very reason to exist. Most of the submarines themselves have long since been carved apart, their dangerous hearts sealed away in the frozen north. But the titanium hulls, the stubborn metal that had fought so hard against the very men who shaped it, proved in the end more durable than the empire that ordered them into being. The Alpha outlived its own country. It remains one of the boldest gambles in the entire history of naval engineering, a vessel that was too fast to catch, too advanced to sustain, and too fragile to survive its own brilliance. It ran faster than anything else beneath the waves, and still it could not outrun the one enemy that truly mattered, the quiet, patient limits of what human beings could actually keep alive. And so the fastest ghost in the ocean slipped at last into silence.